Hi, everybody, and thank you very much for the prayer. I thought it would be important to invoke the intercession of our holy Theotokos, whose heart has been pierced, and so who is very intimate with transformative grief. And so tonight's presentation is going to build upon and sort of supplement a presentation that Dr. Emily Cash gave a couple of months ago for another group. And I had the privilege of listening to her speak about the topic. It's a very timely topic, and it's also an opportunity for us to think about grief more holistically as a society, collectively, which is something that the pandemic is creating for us, this unprecedented opportunity. So I'm going to share my screen and move through some slides. These are different slides. I consolidated a lot of Dr. Cash's slides, and I added some additional information where I thought it would be helpful. So I think that means I won't be able to see your faces. And if you have a question or would like to share a comment, please just go ahead and jump in. Because I won't be able to see you if you raise your hand. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Dr. Rula?
Yes.
Can I interfere a little bit here? I will I will see which one who will raise their hands, and then I'll go ahead and just interrupt you and ask them to go ahead and ask the question. Is that okay?
Yes, thank you. That's perfect. And again, I invite you to jump right in if you have a thought or a question. So tonight, I've sort of laid out three different learning outcomes. So the goal here is to learn about the different types of grief and the stages of grief, to reflect on some questions that are going to help us develop some self-awareness. So we'll have the opportunity to have a group discussion. And then for you to learn a method for how to use the stages of grief and apply them in your life after we finish and you all go back to your lives, to have some idea, a method for how to use this information in the real world. So grief, you might have looked at the slides that Deacon Nicola has been sending around, and thank you for doing that. This is something new I added, so you're not going to find this in the other slides. I thought it was important before we talk about the stages of grief to actually define what grief is. And so, there are a lot of very long and technical definitions for grief out there, but I found that the most accurate and effective definition of the term grief is the shortest one. Grief is the normal process of reacting to a loss. It's the normal process of reacting to a loss. So in this regard, grief is both a universal experience in that any human being that walks the earth is going to experience a loss at some point, if they live long enough, is going to experience a loss. And there's something very normal about going through the process of loss and reacting to it. At the same time, loss is a very personal and individualized experience. There are some commonalities that you'll notice when we start talking about the stages of grief, but the journey for each person is very personal. And so you might have 5 people who experience the exact same loss at the exact same time, but each one, their journey of experiencing that loss is going to be unique. Symptoms of grief can be emotional, physical, social, or religious in nature. Oftentimes, when we think about loss and grief, our minds might automatically go to the emotional side, the sadness, the depression, the sorrow. But just as important, there are physical symptoms of grief that you'll feel and experience in your body. There are social aspects. Oftentimes during a grieving process, your social relationships will be disrupted, and so on. Loss can not just focus on the death of a loved one. Loss can be as expansive as the experience of losing an important relationship. Let's say you grew up with someone and you were friends since you were in the 4th grade, a 20-year friendship that came to an end, not because of death, but the relationship ended. That can trigger a grief response. The loss of a job, loss through theft, or the loss of independence. I often think of aging. A person may be driving for the majority of their life and have that independence of, I have my own car. When I want to go somewhere, I get in the car and I turn it on and I drive myself. Maybe, at the age of 80, 85, that person can no longer drive independently. And there's a loss of independence. And with that, it triggers a grief response. Next, I want to talk about the types of grief. So again, our minds, when we think about grief, we oftentimes think of a person who might have lost a spouse or the loss of a parent. It's sort of on the individual level. We're living now in a time where we have the experience of collective grief. This is grief at a group level and an unprecedented group level, not just family and community, but at the state level, at the country level, and worldwide. There is a loss of normalcy. So again, the grief as defined as the experience of reacting to a loss. Now we're getting into the terrain of more abstract types of losses. So there's a loss of normalcy that we're all experiencing, and a sustained loss of connections within families, within communities, professional work environments, and that can cause some loneliness. And loneliness, aside from being, a very difficult experience to endure, actually has health risks. And so there's some really good research coming out in more recent years and looking at the impact of loneliness on health. And we're finding that there are the health risks associated with loneliness and social isolation are equal to the dangers of smoking and obesity. That is the type of impact, the risk factor that we're facing right now at a collective level. And of course, age groups are going to be experiencing this in different ways. So with that loss of normalcy, there's a loss of important moments like milestones and celebrations. The birth of a grandchild is experienced now very differently than what you would normally do, the whole family coming together and having a celebration, or a milestone, a teenager turning 16 years old and getting, his driver's license. That's a milestone. These are the loss of important moments that have been disrupted, and this is happening collectively. The second type of grief that's slightly different from perhaps our normal assumptions is anticipatory grief. And this is a fancy way of basically saying this is a loss that is out there and it's uncertain and it hasn't happened yet. It's something that causes an uncertainty about what the future holds. And it usually has some element of death, right? So this virus, the coronavirus, for example, creates anticipatory grief. There's something bad out there, and it could, make its way into my life. It could cause death. And so that type of uncertainty results in a feeling of the loss of safety. So again, going back to the definition of grief, reacting to the loss. And so here the loss is the feeling of being safe. And so these are very deep, almost primitive levels of consciousness when we think about safety. And that's being threatened here in some regard. And then the last type of grief I want to talk about is micro and macro grief. So micro grief, it refers to at the more individual level, the type of losses you'll be experiencing. So in our daily lives, in our relationships, encounters, and important moments that are missed or postponed. I think of as an example of an encounter, like every Saturday morning, I like to take my dog and go for a walk, take him to the dog park. And on my way, I stop by my favorite coffee shop. They let me bring my dog in. And everybody in the coffee shop knows me by name, and I know them by name. And I order my favorite coffee drink, and I get it. I have a couple of laughs with the folks at the coffee shop. And then I'm on my way, and I enjoy the rest of the morning walking and sipping my coffee. And so those encounters, that's an example of an encounter on the daily life level that's lost, right? Because now I can't go into that coffee shop. I'll have my coffee at home, but it's not the same. I lost that encounter in the community where I have that community connection. At the macro level, and this is the unprecedented part here, in our world, the larger, longer term impact on society, community, even church of what is happening. Mm-hmm. Okay. I think, was there a comment or was that background noise?
Yeah, background from admin. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. And so at the macro level here, we're talking about disruption and loss. So just think of the loss associated with not being able to travel, or the loss associated with what's happening to the healthcare system. And here's an example of a macro level type of change. Maybe you saw in Disney, maybe Disney World, they blocked off large lots of the parking lot and they turned it into a vaccination center. So changes like this, where this Disneyland or Disney World, I can't remember which one it was, a place where people come and ride roller coasters and take pictures with mouse ears on their heads, right, is shut down. We lost that. And now this is a vaccination center. So that's a huge shift. It's a huge shift. And it triggers all kinds of experiences of loss. So that's an overview, a couple of definitions, a breakdown of types of grief. And now we can get into the stages of grief. Does anybody have a question or a thought or a comment before I continue on what you've heard so far? If it resonates, if this is something that's kind of speaking to you and what you're seeing?
I've actually, I never thought about, all these different types of grief actually. Doesn't, it's like somehow indirectly affect us. I mean, it's definitely an eye opener, even with the, just like how do you describe all these different parts? How would they affect us in a way? Thinking just grief is just when somebody dies or when we lose something, or we lose someone. That's so thank you for this eye opener. Thank you.
I do have a
Go ahead, Nancy.
When you're talking about symptoms of grief or loss, what were you referring to when you said religious in nature?
I there's a little bit of an echo. Let me make sure. So this research.
Everybody, please mute. If you're not speaking, please mute.
Can you hear me okay? Okay, the echo's gone. So I did kind of gloss over that. And Nancy, that's a really good catch. And a lot of it almost, and I probably should have commented on it before moving on, because it is an important part. For some people, the structure and the meaning that they make of the grief and the loss is defined and is given meaning by one's religion. There's that aspect of it. So for some people, they experience the loss as, God's will. And it can have a religious aspect to it. Other people will take it the other way. A person who might have been religious before a loss can lose their faith and sort of go in the other direction and sort of lose that connection to God and to their religious community. So there are some really serious religious aspects to it.
Thank you.
I have a small comment,
Yes.
and it's that, as you started in the second slide, I think, I'm the eternal optimist, and I feel like some of these could also apply to joy.
Like collective joy, anticipatory joy, micro and macro joy.
Yes.
Absolutely. All right, I'll start thinking about my next presentation on
Thank
joy.
you.
Or
That's where I was going.
Maybe you can lead the discussion on joy. Absolutely. And you know what? We will get to joy. We will get to joy in the conclusion. But as you'll see, as I start talking about the stages of grief, it's really important to deal with the loss. That is part of getting to joy, and maintaining that joy is knowing the roadmap, if you will, to face the grief, face the loss. But great comment. Thank you.
Another probably angle for religious is that grief by the whole community. Probably the Shia is a good example of that, when every year they go through the loss of Ali, and you see people really mourning together, and it becomes like an occasion every year. And we Christians probably go through something similar. We're going to be going through that shortly. And some people really take it as a loss that just happened. So maybe that's another angle for communal, whether the community is a religion or a society, across.
Yeah, grief and bereavement, which are two slightly different concepts, are very cultural. How it's expressed and how it's shared depends a lot on one's culture and community. Absolutely. Okay. Any other thoughts or comments? We can jump right into the stages. All right. So the stages of grief. Some of you who might have, for a while been into like Dr. Phil and, some of those pop psychology type of shows, you might be familiar, you might have heard of the stages of grief. So this model has been around since the 1960s. And in the 1960s, it began with a researcher named Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. So Kubler-Ross went around to hospitals, and she started interviewing people who were terminally ill. These are people who had a diagnosis, they were on their deathbeds, essentially, and they were confronted with their own mortality. They knew they were going to die, and she was talking with them and interviewing them, and started to notice that there were very similar patterns and stages that they would go through. Over the years, the researchers continued looking at these stages: denial, anger, bargaining, sadness, acceptance. Those were the first 5. And they began to notice that when a person lost a loved one, like a spouse, a parent, or a child, so not their own death, but the death of a loved one, they noticed that the same patterns held true. And now we're at a point with the research where they're testing it in so many different environments that they're finding, I talked a little bit about these abstract concepts of loss of safety, loss of normalcy, loss of the encounters, etc. And now they're finding that these stages actually hold true for many, many types of loss of a relationship, loss of a job, loss of a house, separation from a community, for example. So the stages start at least the way the theory, the model originally was designed, people start in denial, move into anger, bargaining, sadness, acceptance, and then the sixth stage, meaning, you see there's a little asterisk next to it. This is the newest stage, and I think this is where the researchers are still, they've released some information on that last stage, but they're still fleshing it out. So I'm going to go through each stage really briefly to give you a definition and what are kind of the characteristics and indicators. And then I'll spend a little bit of time talking about how to use this information. It's not a prescription. This is not, you know, you don't have to follow this in order. In fact, in reality, people bounce around from many different, in different orders. You can go from anger to sadness, back and forth before you go to acceptance. So it's not as linear as they first thought. And there's no prescription on how long you should be spending on every stage. So denial. Denial is the immediate reaction. This is the stage where you just doubt that the reality of the loss. And denial is the stage that you can think of as being a coping mechanism. This is your brain's way of slowing down the information. You're like rejecting the information because you're not equipped yet to process the loss. You're not ready to feel the pain of the loss, to face the loss. So you just kind of, you know, doubt that it's really happening. And in this stage, you know, there are these thoughts that it won't affect us. It's really not that bad. But what's really happening here is your body, including your mind, you're not ready to fully experience it. In denial, you know, some kind of phrases that you might hear is, you know, I feel like I'm in a dream and I'm just going to wake up and all of this is going to go away. You know, it's that kind of reaction. Or, you know, for the loss of a loved one, I just feel like he's going to walk into that door again, like he's not really gone. You know, that kind of reaction. So it's totally normal. And it's usually the first reaction that people have. Now, the thing about denial is that if you stay in denial chronically, like this is your zone and you stay in this zone and it's your only zone, it actually puts you and others at risk. So put this in the context of a pandemic. We know there's a virus. We can see the virus under a microscope. It is real. It transmits, you know, through, they have some information about how it's transmitted. To be in denial chronically puts us and others at risk. So that's sort of an example. If you see that denial piece, you might recognize that. The next stage is anger. So with anger, it's sort of like you recognize that there's pain, but anger serves like a mask. It sort of masks other emotions that you're feeling very intensely, but you're just not able to get in touch with them or experience them. So it's very normal for people experiencing loss to become angry. And sometimes the anger is not logical or valid. It's just, you know, you become angry at an object, or you become angry at a person that you lost. And, you know, someone that you might be grieving a loss of, and you're just angry at them. That's a very normal response. The tricky part about the anger phase is that it could be other emotions manifesting as anger. So what really could be happening, sort of going back to our loss of safety, I feel afraid, or I feel helpless. I feel like I have no control of all of these things that are happening around me with this pandemic. But you're not ready to deal with those experiences. And so it comes out in anger. And so blaming others, kind of passive aggressive comments or behavior. This is the stage where you want to develop self-awareness. If you notice that you're angry, this is where you kind of want to just be still and start developing awareness to see, well, is this legitimate anger, or is there something else going on? And that's the hard part. The thing about anger is, if anger is your zone and you like being in that zone and that's where you feel comfortable and you don't go in any other zone and you stay in anger, this results in isolation. And we already talked about the impact of loneliness and isolation, right? And that could have a really serious impact, not just on a person's mind and emotional life, but even physical health risks. But some people enjoy that. I wouldn't say enjoy it, but are comfortable in this zone because it gives you a sense of control. Okay. The next stage is bargaining. So this is another coping mechanism. You're really just trying to cope with the situation, and what your mind does is it bargains. And this is a way to kind of hold on to the hope of a situation when you're experiencing the pain and the loss. And so you might have, it's the brain's attempt to restore order in a place where you have chaos. That's a typo. I should add order in there. And then you start kind of making deals, these transactions. We were kind of, before we started the presentation, we were talking about the transaction, the negotiation, right? Well, if I just get through this month, everything will be okay, right? Or if I wear a mask, I can just go wherever I want, right? And it's these kind of if this, then that type of thinking. And you kind of want to listen to your thoughts, like yourself thinking, your inner thoughts, because that's kind of an indication that you're in the bargaining zone. It does give you a little bit of a break from the pain, and it can help you move from one stage to another. Again, we're listening for what if and if only. If you stay in the bargaining stage for too long, it's another form of avoidance. So it's still, you're still trying to change the outcome, right? When you're bargaining, you're trying to change the outcome. So you haven't quite accepted the new reality yet. And that's why it's considered an avoidance. It's a technique to avoid dealing with the pain. The next stage is sadness. So this is where we finally face reality. Okay, this is happening. I'm experiencing this. I can't travel for the holidays. I can't see my large family during the holidays, where I'm missing out all of these experiences. I can't be there. My, grandfather is ill. Okay, now we're coming to grip with reality, and we're feeling the pain, and you're becoming more fully aware of the loss. And this is where, you're dealing with a little bit of depression, sadness, there's despair, dark feelings, things we don't really necessarily want to experience or face, because we're not sure we can handle it, or, it takes away from our joy. And this is the hard part. But it is a very important part of grieving, because what it does is it slows everybody down, and then you really process the loss. And once you process and come to grips with the truth of the loss and everything that came with it and everything it triggered, then you can rebuild yourself from the ground up, and then it clears the deck for growth. So there's, this is almost like the beginning of the stage when we start thinking about transformation, transformative grief. This is the stage where we're now dealing with it and we're clearing the deck. And from here, we can have an honest rebuilding and grow from it, at least the potential to grow from it. If you stay in sadness, like if this is your zone and you just want to stay in sadness, this could develop into depressive symptoms and even, clinical symptoms where it goes from being a stage to something clinical. And that could be a very dangerous thing as well. Except, yes?
I have a question. Okay.
Sure.
Talking about stages. So at what stage becomes you have to seek some kind of help outside your zone? And, so what type of help that you need to seek at certain stages, and whether if it developed to that stage, the critical stage as you're describing, so you're gonna seek medical or therapy or, because I went through something similar to this, and Wajdi also, he can join me in this. We had the shooting at our base, and we went for a long period of time. We lost our friends, we lost our co-workers, we missed the building, we couldn't fathom the idea why it happened, and could have, should have, would have, ideas keeps running it through your head. And be honest with you, some of it still resonate with me till now. And I know we are resilient people and we go back, we try to snap back into it, but in the back of your mind, it's still there. It doesn't go that easy. So what's your recommendation, and at what stage? That's my question.
That is really such an important question. And thank you for sharing what you shared and asking that question. When you experience loss, and it is to the point where you have very disruptive memories, and there is an indication that maybe there's a form of traumatic stress. So these are the type of memories where it's disruptive and it's not something you're able to control, a sustained inability to sleep, a loss of appetite or changes to the appetite in a prolonged period of time, withdrawal, like sustained withdrawal from relationships. So pulling back from the relationships that you normally stay connected to, and then sustaining that withdrawal. These are all signs that you might be experiencing something a little more serious that might need intervention. If you look at like what the doctors, like what the physicians say, it's slightly different from what psychologists and counselors say. So according to like Western medicine, like Mayo Clinic perspectives, from a physician perspective, they think 1 year should be sufficient. If you continue to grieve in a very severe way beyond 1 year, 12 months, then something more serious is going on. I was looking very carefully at that. But I think, you might notice that there are other severe changes in a shorter period of time. And, it's always good to reach out to a counselor and get an assessment. Usually, psychologists are a good front line. If you find someone with a licensed master's degree that can do an assessment or a consultation with you, they can sit down and sort of work through an assessment and tell you, oh, you have nothing to worry about, or, maybe we should, set up a treatment plan. Some people turn to substance abuse, drinking, alcohol, drugs. I think, if the substance is abused and it's sort of going to the excess, and then it develops into an addiction. There are also specialists out there who can specialize in recovery from substance use disorders. May not be a disorder, but maybe just substance abuse. And I think, psychiatrists are the ones that you go to when you think something chemical is happening. Like if a person, experiences a loss, and maybe, and this can happen, it triggers the onset of mental illness, such as schizophrenia or something more severe like that, then you need a psychiatrist who's going to prescribe medicine. But I think, going to grief counseling or counseling for traumatic stress, these are very normal reactions. And I think if you notice any severity in the changes of sleeping, eating, you're withdrawing from relationships, substance abuse for extended periods of time, then I would recommend, reaching out and maybe getting a consultation.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm. All right, so our last stage is acceptance. So we go through all the hard stuff. So we go through the sadness, and then acceptance is the fifth stage. This is the one where there's been about 30 or 40 years of research that shows that, this stage is, people, is a very normal stage. This is the stage not when, and actually Deacon Nicola, you kind of described acceptance where it's not all right. It's not okay what happened. It still, comes up from time to time. It's not okay, but accepting the reality. Now we've accepted the reality. We are not denying it. We're not, we've kind of worked through the anger. We felt the sadness, and the sadness might come and go. I'll talk a little bit about what that looks like when you go from acceptance back to other stages. That's very normal. But the idea here is that you can put the loss into some kind of perspective. And so we begin to withdraw all the energy from focusing on the loss, and then we begin to invest it into life. So we're not okay with what happened. But I can, I'm not thinking about it. Maybe I'm not thinking about it 15 hours a day anymore. I'm thinking about it maybe 4 hours a day. And then you notice that now you're starting to put your energy back into moving forward, not necessarily moving on. And that's the tricky part about acceptance. It's sort of like you're moving forward, but that pain, that loss, you still recognize that it's there. So I found this graphic, and I think it's so true. I wanted to share it with you. So when we first started talking about the stages of grief in the field of psychology, it was this beautiful, clean line. You start in denial, you go to anger, depression, bargaining, and acceptance. But the reality is the road looks more like this. You're going to go in many twists and turns. It's very normal to jump back and forth from one stage. You think you're in acceptance, like right here, and then you loop back around, and then you eventually make your way toward acceptance. But this part is just the difficult part to get to, and it's not a straight line. So yes, I'll pause there.
Rima, go ahead. You're muted.
So you actually just touched upon part of my question. It's a two-part. So yes, you can go all over the place before you get, I guess, to acceptance. Well, listening to you describe all these stages, and I waited till the end so I could be sure of what I want to say. In my particular case, I did not seem, because this could all be unconscious without realizing it, but I did not seem to have a problem with accepting the passing of my father. In fact, February 28th was 26 years. He went into the hospital on the 16th on my birthday. And I would like to know, because I did not grieve until 1 year later on my birthday when I was by myself in Switzerland. And I feel like a lot of that, when I think back, and it's funny, listening to this actually brought it back to my mind that I believe that two of the factors that made the most impact were feelings of guilt, because I was working down in the South at the time in Birmingham, Alabama, and wasn't home with the family. When he passed, it was all kind of very sudden. It was 2 weeks later, he died. But so guilt for not being there or helping or doing my share or whatever. And the other is the sense of responsibility that I always put on myself, especially within my family unit, for taking care of and handling and managing things. So I don't know how and where all that fits in, but I feel like I was already at acceptance in terms of accepting his passing, but not accepting, I think, me dealing with all this.
Yeah, that's
fine.
Yeah, and I think, there's no real timeline on this. So what you described as, you kind of were fine for a year and then all of a sudden it hit you. That's also very normal because there's no timeline and no one can say to you what stage you should be in and for how long you should be in that stage. I read some really good information from Kubler-Ross, who actually commented that not everybody goes through all 5 stages.
Exactly.
And that came from the researcher herself. So she said most people experience at least 2. That's what she said. And it's very common for people to jump around from, they'll go forward and back and forward and back. But, there's no timeline on it. And so if you skip stages, that very much can be the case. And the researchers that's consistent with the research.
Thank you.
So Norma, Rima, you are normal. No, I'm just kidding.
I'm so glad somebody finally agrees with me.
We're going to talk about normalizing, and that's a great segue. But are there any other questions or comments? I'm so, grateful for, the questions and what you all are sharing.
A question?
Please.
Thanks, Deacon. Thanks, Doctor, for the presentation and information. What prompts the shift or change from one stage into another?
So I think it kind of takes its own course. There's a method that I'm going to show you about basically how to be aware of which stage you're in. And your awareness can actually help you deal with whatever you should deal with when you're in that stage. And so if you confront it, like, for example, if you refuse to feel pain, if you refuse to, be angry, allow yourself to be angry because it's just not an acceptable emotion to have, it's just kind of a taboo to be angry. That can actually delay your ability to move from one stage to the other if you genuinely have anger. So I think getting stuck is a real thing. I'm going to talk a little bit about this method for identifying, normalizing, and predicting. This method can actually help you in that journey and help people in that journey. If you tend to have an internal voice where you're very critical of yourself, you're kind of, stunting your ability to feel whatever you need to feel. And so that can be a part of making it difficult for you to move from one stage to another. So I'll get into that a little bit more in detail when we get to that point. So I think I might have partially answered your question, not fully yet.
Thank you. Yeah, that was pretty good. Helpful.
Go ahead.
Okay. So let's just kind of pause. And if you have a, piece of paper and a pen near you, I'm not going to ask anybody to share. I'm not going to put anybody on the spot. If you want to, you're safe. This is a safe environment. Nobody's going to judge or criticize what you're saying or what you're sharing. But I think, if you have a piece of paper nearby and you can grab a pen, you might want to, we'll work through these questions, and maybe you can just kind of write down your thoughts. And this is for yourself to look at later and to think about as we all, and the thing is, we're all in this together right now. So we're all we all have something to write down. So there's nothing unique in the regard of loss. So I just want to encourage you to, I want to ask this question. Looking into your own past experience of loss, what stage or experience has been the most challenging for you? What is the most challenging stage? And so I'm going to go back to the, there it is. So these are all the stages: denial, anger, bargaining, sadness, acceptance. I'm going to talk about meaning at the very end. But if you can kind of think about, maybe a loss that you have from the pandemic, just the disruption to your life, or a person you lost, and just sort of looking at that, which stage seems to be the hardest, the most challenging. And you can sort of, pick out the one, and then that can be a point of reflection. So we have denial, anger, bargaining, sadness, acceptance.
Dr. Rula, I remember from the resilience or the counseling, I thought you're going to ask us to draw a pig, and whether he's facing left or right, small ears, large ears, small feet, close together, and each one means something. I says, oh, we're going through the exercise again.
No, I won't ask you to draw anything. If you want to draw a pig with one eye east and one eye west, you're more than welcome. So going back to our goals, the goal here was to develop some self-awareness, right? So there's no right answer, there's no wrong answer. It's about your answer. Now, is there a stage, and this is something you can write down as well, is there a stage of grieving that I find myself in at this moment? At this moment, is there a stage that you might be in? So you can think about that for a moment and maybe write down your thoughts. Again, the stages are denial, anger, sadness, bargaining, and depression. No, what did I say? I messed them up. Let me move back to the other one. There they are. Denial, anger, depression, bargaining, acceptance. So just sort of getting in touch, am I grieving something right now? And if so, what stage am I in? And can you identify the stage that you're in? That's even more information. What we're doing here is we're kind of developing that self-awareness. If I were to write down the strengths and resources I have in my life at this moment, what would they be? So you can think about, I have a really good support system. I have enough resources to go to counseling if I have health insurance and I can go to counseling if I need to. Or, I like to run and I'm in good health. So when I feel angry, I go for a run. That can be a strength,
How about contentment? Could it be a strength?
Contentment. I mean,
Yes.
your faith, absolutely. I mean, having that contentment, your faith, having,
Well, it's
you
not,
know,
it doesn't relate just to faith, you know.
yeah, to be content, absolutely. I mean, yeah, your own contentment, your resiliency. If you have a positive outlook, who was it? I'm looking for, who was it that said, I'm an eternal optimist? Was that,
That might be Waleed.
Oh, yeah,
Well,
that's me.
okay,
I
so
can tell.
that is a strength, right? That is a resource and a strength. It's almost like a buffer, right? That can help with grief. Mhm.
Yeah, my wife just informed me that I get that from her.
Oh, okay. Got to give credit where credit is due. Okay, a few more seconds there. And the last question is just, as you watch, as this pandemic continues, as you're watching the changes in your community and in the world, what do you notice within yourself? What is happening to your emotional life? What is happening to your relationships? In your spiritual life? In your physical life? I'll just give you a moment. I've actually heard many people say that while the pandemic has affected, you know, the normalcy, they've actually grown in their faith life. They're spending more time in prayer than they did before, which, you know, there are these, you know, opportunities that it poses. Mm-hmm. So I'll open up the floor. Like I said, there was no right or wrong answer, and there's no pressure to share. But if you learned something, if something about answering these questions stood out to you, and you feel, you know, inspired to share, I'll just open up the floor to anyone who might be so inclined.
I'll share.
Go ahead.
So I guess for the first point, I would say the stage or experience that's the most challenging for me now, not as a result of my father's passing, but now during this pandemic and whatever, is anger at self, which applies to the other one as well. The second one, stage of grieving that I find myself in at this moment, and again, I put anger, but it's really more bargaining. And again, it all relates to the pandemic. I'm constantly making deals with myself to finish this or to do that, and then I can do this. And the feeling of being overwhelmed is the last one. I'm constantly feeling overwhelmed. Actually, number 3 was exercise, my faith, the T&T, Tuesdays and Thursdays. I love it. That has really helped sustain me. I have started to grow, but it only made me realize how much more I've got to go. I will never finish in my lifetime, but that's okay, because God willing, I'll be right up there with him by the time, you know, I get what I get. And it's these feelings of always being overwhelmed and not being able to finish or do. And I feel like I'm being stretched and everybody's asking for something from me and wanting me to do something and whatever, that I get angry for always saying okay and yes. And I get angry for not completing the tasks I have in my head or that I've written on a piece of paper. So probably the single biggest would be anger and this whole bargaining, all related to my life and trying to deal with it. The exercise helps. I walk every single day and I participate in Zumba a couple times a week and whatever. But between exercise and the faith and the T&Ts, that's the only thing that has kept me from Really going under.
That's, thank you so much for sharing such an honest sort of assessment. I think that's very courageous. And it certainly sounds like you're on your journey, and you're very committed to it.
Thank you.
I'll share since nobody wants to share. When it comes to the pandemic, it's really very stressful. Being isolated from your friends, we accepted the fact that's what it is. We can't do anything about it except cooperating and moving ahead and be positive. But where I tend to find myself like cornered, when everybody depends to pull that positive energy from you with their negativeness, and you are their counselor, around the clock. And I don't know how to separate my personal things from their personal things. When I give my ideas or my thoughts or share something I have or my opinion, I am emotionally telling them this is what I'll do if it happens with me personally. So I get attached to their problem, instead of separating myself, and I start living what their symptoms are. And I understand the let go policy. If we lost somebody, they've been 6 foot under for so many years, and we're still carrying that baggage on our shoulders, weighing us down. I can deal with all that. I can put an end to that and don't drill on it because I can't do nothing. What I'm in charge of is from this second on. Second ago, it's already been gone, so I start thinking forward, and that's where I draw all my energy from. But really that bothers me the most, which is the last, is when I come to think, because I'm a critical thinker, more or less, and I start feeling like there is a hollow, like a tunnel, black tunnel, and I cannot even process a very simple idea. It just, whether you want to call it overwhelmed or whatever. So that's, my only way out is praying and being more in the Word of God. And that's what's been helping me tremendously. But I cannot walk away from all this negative energy that compelled, because everybody thinks I'm the only solution to their problems. And I don't know how to stop it. And I don't know how to go forward from it. So.
Yeah, I think you highlighted some really important strengths, the strength of having your faith and going into prayer and the community. What you described kind of sounds like something we hear in the field. This is something that emerged from the nursing field. It's called compassion fatigue. And this is something, it's actually a term, and it's a real thing that happens. Nurses, all they do is care. They care for people who are sick constantly. And they find that over time, when they begin to become so desensitized to it, because they're just becoming numb, because they have this fatigue. It's called compassion fatigue. They just don't have any more compassion to express after a while. And so there's some interesting literature about how to kind of deal with that. And it almost sounds like, when you have a lot of people relying on you for positivity and compassion, it almost sounds like something very similar. But you highlighted some really important strengths as well, and good uses of it. Any other folks feeling inspired to share? No pressure, but I want to make sure you have an opportunity if you'd like to. Eleni.
Oh, Deacon, everything you were saying, I felt like you were talking for me. Because I'm exactly the same way in terms of being empathetic with others and that sort of thing. But something that I have found, and I think it's because of our other book club and it's really opened my eyes, is because I feel that sadness, or you feel like you have suffered, there stems a joy from it, because you do turn to your faith, you do turn to your family, you turn to those things that are that positive thing, and it helps you come to that level of acceptance. So I'm kind of grateful for that sadness in a weird way, because without that experience, I wouldn't reach that level of that deeper love or deeper appreciation for so many things. You know, it's like you have to sort of feel that pain to really say, I really am blessed, you know, kind of not dwell on the sadness too much, but, you know, feel a little bit of it. But it's just to feel that level of acceptance and be at peace and feel the joy. But it's hard because I go back and forth. It's like it's never fully acceptance, because I always go back and I'm like, oh, I really miss this. So it's just, and it's like talking to myself. You'll find the silver lining, find and move away from that toxic environment or social media and stuff. Just try to pull the positive thing and don't feed into the, I know I'm rambling, but I'm just, it's like, it's funny because it's like we reach a level of acceptance, possibly, not everybody does, but it's just, I do appreciate the sadness because I need it to be a better person.
You're muted, Rula.
I was just commenting on how that was really well said, and how much I appreciate your sharing that. And I think everything you just described about going back and forth, it's totally normal. I think that maybe we have this idea, and these are messages we get from our society and from culture, that, you know, you grieve and then you move on and you should be fine. You're supposed to just be fine and move on. And the truth is, that's not reality. That's not how grief works. But we do get those messages. And sometimes we think that, you know, this happened 20 years ago, it shouldn't affect me anymore. And that's just not the way it works. So I think you kind of highlighted that too. Any other thoughts before we kind of head into our wrap up here? All right. So I want to leave you with some technique. Okay, so well, first of all, thank you so much for everybody who shared. And even for those of you who didn't share, I really appreciate your just listening and participating. And I hope you got something even just out of writing your answers to think about it and keep that with you as we move forward. So I didn't want to just kind of zoom through the stages and open up these, you know, for some of you, wounds, without giving you a sense of, you know, empowerment about how you can use this. So I think there was a really good question, and I can't remember who asked it, but it was a really good question about how do you move from one stage to the next, right? So let's be practical and let's get down to operationalizing these techniques. So what we know is it's a 3-stage process, and what we just did together was part of it. And what we did together was identifying. So the first stage is to identify, you know, and to learn to be still and to recognize, right now I am angry, or right now I'm feeling sad. It could be that simple. That's how simple a thought is, to just simply recognize, you know, or right now I'm in denial. This isn't happening. This isn't real. I'm just going to wake up from a dream. So you know now a little bit of what each stage sounds like. And so the challenge is to identify. If you're just off and you're not sure what's going on, be still, and try to get in touch with what you think is going on, what you're feeling. So we did that a little bit together with the exercise. Normalize is the next stage, the next part of applying this. So once you identify what stage you're in, let's say it's anger. Okay, I know I'm angry. I know that much. Now we start paying attention to the tone of voice you're using. Are you telling yourself, well, you shouldn't be angry? That's irrational. That's so selfish of you, right? If you hear that voice, you're being selfish. Why are you angry? Or, you know, some kind of a critical voice. You want to be aware of that, how you talk to yourself. Because if you're repressing, if you're kind of like not letting yourself feel it, that means that you're not allowing yourself to go through something that should be normal, even though it's illogical and irrational, right? So just kind of paying attention to what you're saying to yourself, and then allowing yourself to just go through, feel it like it's normal, whatever it is, whatever comes up, it's normal. You're just gonna let it happen. And then predict is the last part. So the best mechanism for you to kind of predict how you might react to a future loss is to look at how you reacted to loss in the past. So we did this a little bit with our exercise, but if you want to kind of analyze it a little bit more and really like go back to the last 3 times you can think of where you experienced a loss and see if you can notice a pattern. Like, do you notice that you go into bargaining and every time like your go-to zone is to bargain? And your bargain is, God, if you give me this, I will do that. and you know, that's your go-to stage. Then now you know, okay, next time if I experience a loss, I'm going to anticipate that I'm probably going to react the same way. And when I do, if I do, I'm going to come in with my resources. I'm going to be self-aware. I'm going to reach out to friends in my community. I'm going to talk to somebody. I'm going to try to kind of work through that. And so this is in a very simple way. And, you know, it's pulling from Dr. Emily Cash's slides, but I consolidated it into a very simple, like 1, 2, 3 type of thing. If you want all the details about it, you can please refer to her slides. But I think this is just something you can probably remember: identify, normalize, predict, and then you carry that with you. So that's a method for how to apply this. And then I said earlier that I wanted to talk about that last stage, which was meaning. And this is the stage where researchers are trying to take the model, you know, after acceptance. They know that there's this stage that comes after acceptance, and they can't quite put their finger on it. They call it meaning making. And it's very nebulous, and they know it's spiritual. And that's what the scientists and the researchers are saying. And I think this is where our faith could be a really powerful framework for understanding the transformative aspect of grief and sorrow. And the reason why I asked Father for the prayer, I wasn't bargaining with you, but it was on my mind, in my heart, actually, for 2 days. I wanted to ask for that prayer because nobody experienced grief more perfectly than the Theotokos. She's a perfect model of grief and elevated that grief to holiness, and for something that became meaningful for all of mankind. Standing at the foot of the cross, watching what she watched, understanding and recognizing in faith that this is for the salvation of humanity. This is like a perfect example of transformative grief, the way, as you know, when I think about the Theotokos. So I wanted to sort of leave it there. And I think this is what the researchers, at least with this group, I'll share, this is what the researchers are grasping for. And I think we have something very special in our faith. with us. And I am very grateful for Father and Deacon for just a chance to share this information. I hope it was meaningful. I'm very thankful to the Theotokos. And I'll stop there if you have any questions or comments, but I'm done.
Well, Father, I'll give you, I want to take a moment. I want you to go ahead and comment, but I'll leave the floor to you. But I would like to take a second to thank Dr. Rula for accepting, giving us this meaningful and wonderful education. And we really, all of us, benefit from it. I'm quite positive about it, that every one of us have learned something out of it. And your conclusion can't be any better. So kudos to you, as we say in the Navy. You know, job well done, and thank you again.
Hey, Rola, do you mind stopping the sharing so we can see everyone?
Yes.
Please, thank you.
Okay, there you go.
There we go.
Well,
Thank you, Dr. Rola.
Rola, thank
Great
you.
job. Appreciate it.
It is much needed, these kind of conversations and these kinds of presentations. It's, you know, as much as it's important to always listen to the spiritual parts of stuff, I think it is sometimes we forgot about the medical or these kinds of approaches, not only through faith, which is, of course, it's important, but it's, you know, what you talked about us, it is also a very important component, how to deal with things. So thank you. I know, you know, a lot of us like the, you know, we want to hear about, you know, what Jesus said and all of this, which is, of course, it's very important in what our faith teaches, but also it's also as important looking at the medical field and how to deal with these things beside faith. So thank you so